This weekend, the Louisville Cardinals have the chance to send a message across the ACC when they play Georgia Tech. What's at stake in this matchup, the keys to victory, and more coming up on this preview episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Card Nation, what is going on, everyone? Welcome into this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I want to take this time to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. And just a reminder, Locked On Louisville free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off of your first purchase. We dive into the Georgia Tech preview on the show today, discussing what is at stake for the Cardinals with a win and a loss, keys to victory against the Rambling Wreck, and then we'll give an overview of what happened in the ACC Week 3, the biggest risers and fallers, key narratives, and the matchups to watch for this upcoming week. So a jam-packed schedule on this Wednesday edition of the show. If you haven't checked out yesterday's episode, be sure to do so. I welcomed in Georgia Tech's Sports Illustrated publisher, Jackson Caudell. He did a great job of delivering some insightful information as to what to expect from Georgia Tech, some more analysis on the offensive and defensive side. I know Georgia Tech is a very interesting opponent that it's still to be determined, well, just how good are the Yellow Jackets? So be sure to check out that episode. It gives you a little bit more of an insight. And if you have been a fan of the show spanning over a year, meaning that if you followed the show last season, you know one segment that I like to do at the beginning of every true preview is to discuss what is at stake for the Cardinals against a certain opponent in a certain week, because I think it paints a great picture of the context, the key narratives and storylines, and much, much more. Now, we haven't done that this season simply because the Cardinals played two non-Power 5 opponents that they should have and did beat by over 20 points. So really not much at stake there other than handling business and don't have a historically bad loss. And thankfully, Louisville did do the first of the two. They handle business. So we bring back that segment for the ACC opener. The Cardinals will host the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets on Saturday afternoon, 3:30 kickoff at Cardinal Stadium. So I wanted to break this down into two sections. What's at stake with a win? What's at stake with a loss? Now, this is the first opportunity the nation and pretty much everyone will get to watch Louisville play a more comparable opponent when it comes to talent. Like, this will be the first quote-unquote test, and we still don't know how good Georgia Tech is, but I can tell you Georgia Tech is not a bad team. So I had a couple things down as to what is at stake with a win. And it's nothing too groundbreaking, but it is significant in its own way. For starters, this feels very technical. You stay undefeated. With a win, you move to 3-0. It's early in the season, but you stay undefeated and you advance a week without a loss on your schedule. And well, yeah, of course, Dalton, I mean, you win the game, you're going to be undefeated. Well, what's the significance in that? Well, the significance is just that. Like we mentioned that if you want to get to a college football playoff, if you want to compete for an ACC championship bid again, I think that for the college football playoff, I think Louisville has to go 10-2 in the regular season to be truly in consideration. Like, does 9-3 get you in? With the way the narratives have changed with the ACC and how SEC is bolstered up, and same with the Big Ten, I don't think 9-3 gets you in at all. I think you have to go at least 10-2. So beating Georgia Tech, and I know that Louisville is favored by 10.5. Some will say, well, they should have beat them by double digits. Technically, Vegas believes so, and I mean, Vegas shows you that they're not wrong all the time. But I guess this is me being a little bit higher on this Georgia Tech team than most, because a conference win is significant regardless. And that is pretty much the main storyline here is that you can send a message across the ACC. If you win this game, for starters, you're like, okay, those that believe that Louisville's a little bit further down the pecking order and power rankings, it's time to adjust that and raise us back up. If Louisville wins by double digits, you start to think, whoa, okay. Maybe this Louisville team definitely should be in the conversation with Miami and Clemson as well. So you have a chance to really control the narrative here, because you win this game and maybe it doesn't do much for you on the national landscape other than just another win. It doesn't hurt you in the national landscape. That's the main thing. But when it looks to the conference side of things, you open up against a key team, and we don't know how good Georgia Tech is going to be. I mean, Georgia Tech has a pretty brutal schedule for the remainder of the season. Like, Louisville kind of kicks off that schedule. I mean, they'll play Duke, North Carolina, Notre Dame, Virginia Tech, Miami, NC State, and Georgia. Like, Miami's the only team in conference that I see there that I know for a fact that I feel like Georgia Tech is going to lose to. The other ones are toss-ups. Like, NC State, North Carolina really haven't looked all that great. Virginia Tech, same way. There is a very good chance that this Tech team, now they may not. Let me be completely clear on this. But I think that there's a good chance that when you talk about ACC contenders here in about 2 months, like early November, I think that you're going to have Georgia Tech in that conversation. Like, right now, the loss to Syracuse looms large for them. But if they were to lose to Louisville, you give them 2 losses, and that pretty much makes it to where they can't have much more of a margin for error. Like, if they have that third ACC loss, I don't think a team with 3 ACC losses is going to get to the conference championship game. So for Louisville, what's at stake is they can put an ACC opponent on the ropes by giving them another loss. And even if Georgia Tech were to theoretically, in this hypothetical, run the rest of the table in conference to where they only have 2 conference losses, if Louisville is right there, then they have the head-to-head advantage. So this does have larger conference implications than you might be led to believe. I know that Louisville is a 10.5-point favorite. Can they win this game by double digits? Yes. Could they lose this game as well? Also true. It's just going to be a matter of which Louisville team shows up and how good they play on both sides of the football. So at stake here, it's just a matter of sending a message across the conference, showing that, hey, look, you all don't talk about us enough already. It's time to start. And here's reason number 1 why that is. Like, the main narrative right now is, well, Louisville's beaten up on 2 inferior opponents. Beat Georgia Tech, and that narrative starts to change a little bit. You can start to control that. Well, with a loss, this is the main thing, is you lose control of that narrative. I would argue that a loss might hurt more than a win could help. It's still one of those situations you kind of apply the the previous notion that if you're favored to beat a team by double digits, you stand less to gain with a win than you do more to lose with a loss. And I think that that's true. It's not true to the extent of Jacksonville State and Austin Peay, but it still does apply here because this is a team that Louisville should be. It's control what you can control, and if you handle business, I think you're going to take care of business. But ultimately, that is the reality. If you lose this game, the optics of it, the opponent is a team that you're favored to beat by double digits, you start to lose control of that national narrative. And I know that there's a portion of this fan base that truly cares about that, and I'm not going to joke on you if you do. Personally, I think that the narrative doesn't really matter at the moment. It's just a matter of if you keep winning, the narrative will correct itself. But you kind of you go against what you've been saying. You know, I mean, the whole take from Louisville fans is that, hey, we're a top 3 team in the ACC. We're going to be right in the mix of things as it relates to getting back to Charlotte. And we're going to be one of the teams that you should talk about the most this season. You lose to Georgia Tech, and it's not the end of the world. But it does change the narrative. But another thing that it does, and this is probably the more crucial of it, I mean, well, outside of you give Georgia Tech the tiebreaker, both of you have one conference loss, and I talked about how Georgia Tech could be pretty successful in the remainder of the conference play when you still have to play Miami and Clemson and some other teams, right? Boston College on the road. So winning this game is key there. But also, if you remember a couple days ago, I said that Louisville, at the very worst, needed to split these two games against Georgia Tech and Notre Dame because you have to win 10 games to get in the playoff, in my opinion. If you lose to Georgia Tech, it almost makes Notre Dame a must-win game. I would argue that it does make Notre Dame a must-win game because if you lose to Notre Dame, that means you have to beat Clemson on the road, you have to beat Miami, you have to beat Kentucky on the road, you have to beat Boston College on the road. And if you do not, then you're not going to get to the college football playoff. You're probably not going to get back to Charlotte. So there's a lot that hinges on this matchup more than what meets the eye. A lot of people see this as, oh, it's just a Georgia Tech team. This is a pretty decent Georgia Tech team. So what does Louisville need to do to beat Georgia Tech? There are three things, three keys to victory, and we'll identify what those are coming up on the next segment of Locked On Louisville. Cardinal fans, you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you go to FanDuel.com, you'll see that the Cardinals are currently a 10.5-point favorite over the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets on Saturday. But we have something a little different for you. Now through the end of this week, September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com today and download America's #1 sportsbook. Also, before we get into the next segment, I want to tell you about our title sponsor, our friends of the show. Title sponsor of this episode, Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite events even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I recently got my tickets to the Game Time through the Game Time app to the Georgia Tech game. Found the tickets that were cheaper than any other section and row or any other service, I should say, in that section and row. And I did it all through the app. The app is the main thing. You get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. There's the lowest price guarantee, which is what I mean. Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference if you find tickets in the same section and row for less. And my purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Well, it's game time. Into the next segment of Locked On Louisville, this Wednesday edition, previewing the Georgia Tech matchup. Thanks again for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville, free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. Georgia Tech is a formidable opponent. I do think that Louisville will win this game, but what do they need to do to come out victorious? Well, there are three keys to victory. It starts with containing Haynes King and getting into the backfield. Haynes King has shown that he is at his strongest when he's able to improvise. Now, last season was sort of an up and down year for him. He had a career-high 27 passing touchdowns with 16 interceptions. He made some key decision errors, and a lot of those errors came in about 3 or 4 different games. 6 touchdowns to 1 interception this season. He has 3 rushing touchdowns. So far, through almost, or pretty much actually, a third of the season for the Yellow Jackets, he's been much more efficient. He's throwing the ball deeper. He's averaging over 1 more yard per completion. So he's showing that he's getting better and being more efficient doing so. But he still is an absolutely lethal mobile quarterback. Would you consider him a dual threat? That I'm not necessarily so sure. I do think that Buster Faulkner does give Haynes King a lot of options to run the football. I would call him a dual threat. He's averaging 6 yards per carry, 3 touchdowns, Yeah, he's second on the team in rushing yards. He's averaging just about, what is it? I mean, you consider him a rushing quarterback. He's averaging just under, let's say, 40 yards per game. But he's averaging over 40 yards per game. But ultimately, he's the second leading rusher for Georgia Tech. One issue with Louisville is the ability to contain the mobile quarterback. And we've seen how that hurt Louisville all last season. We saw Jacksonville State's quarterback run for over 100 yards. Haynes King had 50 rushing yards against Louisville last time they played in the season opener in 23. The main thing that Louisville has to do is make Haynes King uncomfortable. If you take away his ability to run, if you put a spy out in the defensive backfield and you force it to where Haynes King has to throw the football, you take away a key impact of his game. And one other thing to focus on is that Georgia Tech has yet to allow a single sack all season long, and that is playing against Florida State and Syracuse. Not to mention not allowing a single sack is key. So they're giving Haynes King a lot of time to throw. He's making quick decisions. So you have to make sure that you speed up his progressions, make him go through his reads quicker than he's normally used to. You just have to make him uncomfortable. And I think that that's the number one key here is containing Haynes King and forcing him to stay in the pocket. Because if you allow him to scamper for big chunk yardage, that's where the issue is going to arise defensively. And that leads us into key number 2. We stay on the defensive side, limit big plays. Georgia Tech has really good skill position players all over the field. They brought back the majority of their starting offense last season. Eric Singleton, Malik Rutherford, both have over 250 yards on the season so far. Now, I know that this is an offense that likes to set up the pass with the rush, right? But ultimately, they do a great job of getting their playmakers the ball out in space, whether that is the wide receivers, whether that is Jamal Haynes, you name it. Malik Rutherford had 5 for 85 in this matchup last season against the Cardinals. Eric Singleton caught a touchdown against Louisville, and Jamal Haynes had 4 for 56 in terms of receptions and receiving yards, respectively. So this is a defense that should know all about the personnel that they're going up against. Hopefully the familiarity and another full season of film allows Louisville to better prepare for Haynes King than they did in that opener last year. And you can make the case that a lot of their issues came just in that second quarter, but it was magnified tremendously because the final score was what it was. Louisville entered that game or entered halftime down by double digits. So you have to limit the big plays. You have to force Georgia Tech's offense to be able to extend drives and, get first downs moving down the field. The more you allow big plays to their skill guys, the easier it's going to be for their offense to get points. And one thing you don't want to do is turn this into a shootout if you are the Louisville Cardinals. And I think that Louisville's offense can score, but just imagine if Louisville's offense does a good job of scoring the football, and then they also make life tough for Georgia Tech's offense, it could be a rather uneventful day on Saturday, and that is the hope. The third key to the game is you have to start the game out strong. This isn't really as much of a result of last year's game. It's just how well Georgia Tech plays against ranked teams, especially on the road last year. They beat Miami and North Carolina on the road. I know that Miami game was just fluky. They should have needed the ball. They didn't. They beat North Carolina on the road. They tested Georgia really, really contended in that game. Now, the Mississippi game, that was a blowout, but then they beat Florida State this year. They're 3-2 against top 25 teams in Brent Key's short head coaching tenure. And that might not seem like a lot, but this is literally within like a season and a chunk of the next. So I'm saying that to say that he always gets his team ready to play. The moment is never too bright, and they usually come into the game ready to play. So if Louisville wants to make sure that they don't get upset on Saturday, they need to come into the game ready to play. That usually is something that Louisville does a really good job at. They don't do they don't allow a lot of first quarter touchdowns. and I think they have a streak of not allowing a bunch of first quarter touchdowns in consecutive games. But you start the game out strong, you limit the big plays from the Georgia Tech offense, and you contain Haynes King and keep him in the backfield and get after the quarterback. I think all that's going to combine to create a nice Saturday result for the Louisville Cardinals. And we'll continue to break down this matchup. We'll have one more episode during the week where we'll really, dive into the preview and talk a little bit more players to watch and much more. But for the remainder of the show, ACC takeaways from week 3. It was a very interesting week, right, for the ACC. I felt like we learned a good amount. We'll tell you what we learned, the biggest riser and faller, and the key matchups to watch in week 4 coming up on the next segment of Locked on Louisville. Hey, Louisville fans, have you heard about ROY? It stands for Return on You, and it's a new platform that lets you, the fans, get involved in NIL like never before by making contributions directly to your favorite athletes. When fans contribute to a successful campaign, they receive access to exclusive content from the athlete, such as their announcement decision, behind-the-scenes footage, and other personal reflections, all of which are available only to the fans who supported that particular athlete. By using ROY, fans not only support athletes financially, but also become a part of their name, image, and likeness journey, helping them succeed both on and off the field. Download ROY for iOS or Android and enter the referral code LOCKEDON, and you'll automatically be entered into a sweepstakes to win $5,000 cash. Get off the sidelines and into the NIL game with ROY. Support the players and change the game with ROY. Into the final segment of this Wednesday edition of the Locked on Louisville podcast, grand overview of what happened in week 3 of ACC play. Biggest riser, biggest faller. Main thing I wanted to focus on was just how good was Boston College. Well, they gave Missouri almost all they can handle. They only lost 27-21. I know one of their touchdowns was a broken play fluke, but they pretty much held the Missouri offense in check. They did a good job of keeping the game close, and I would take this as, I don't like to take a lot of moral victories, but you went to number 6 on the road, an SEC team, and you lost by 6. So Boston College, I think, proved that they're going to be sort of atop of the ACC echelon. So nice to see what they did. Florida State continued their spiral. They lost to Memphis. They are 0-3. NC State struggled with Louisiana Tech. Georgia Tech demolished VMI. Miami demolished Ball State. Wake Forest got smacked at home to Mississippi. Pittsburgh, another come-from-behind victory against West Virginia. Duke edged out UConn with a 9-point fourth quarter. North Carolina handled business against North Carolina Central. Virginia Tech beat Old Dominion. Virginia, first loss of the season, coming to Maryland, and Cal stays undefeated with a victory over San Diego State. So biggest riser, biggest faller. The biggest riser here for me is a different one that I didn't really have much of an opinion on yet. The Pittsburgh Panthers are 3-0. 2 come-from-behind victories, one at Cincinnati, one at home against West Virginia, 2 Power 5 Big 12 opponents. They will play Youngstown State this weekend, and I was impressed by what I saw from Pat Narduzzi's team. Just how good is Pittsburgh? That is still to be determined, but what I saw from them this week, they are the biggest riser in my opinion. And the biggest faller, it's the Florida State Seminoles. 0-3. A loss to Memphis. Offense, once again, just looked really, really bad. The defense wasn't terrible, but it wasn't good either. They're playing California this week, and I think that's a very, very interesting matchup. And I think there's a very good chance that the Florida State Seminoles could end up starting the season 0-4. That's pretty wild to think about. Top 3 games that we are watching this weekend. Outside of Louisville, Georgia Tech, right? Let's be fair. Let's say outside of Georgia Tech. The first one, Boston College will host Michigan State up in Boston. 8 o'clock kickoff on Saturday. Michigan State 3-0 on the season. They've beaten FAU, Prairie View, and Maryland. Not necessarily, completely setting the world on fire here, but Michigan State is still a key opponent, and I want to see if Boston College can keep up these performances. They need to get a win. If Boston College wins this game, we have a very real conversation this time next week. But right now, this is a key matchup that I think Louisville fans need to watch because we're still trying to gather data to support or refute the point that Boston College is a good football team. So we will see how that works out. Number 2, we just mentioned it, California at Florida State. This will be the first ACC game ever for the Bears. They will go on the road to Florida State, and they have a chance to do the funniest thing and give Mike Norvell's team yet another loss to start the season, making Florida State 0-4, 0-3 in conference play before they go on the road to SMU. And I'm just interested to see how far this skid is going to go for Florida State. And if California can beat them, the conversation is going to be really, really brutal down in Tallahassee. And as a Louisville fan, I sit there and say, damn, that sucks. Anyway, final matchup to watch for. There were a couple of them. I wanted to look at NC State and Clemson, but NC State is starting a true freshman at quarterback, so it's one of those that I kind of sat off to the side because it still is one to focus on. James Madison at North Carolina was an interesting one. Rutgers at Virginia Tech, and then TCU at SMU. I want to see Stanford at Syracuse. I don't think Stanford is really that great of a team, but I do want to get a little bit of a measuring stick as it relates to the rest of the conference. And on the flip side, Syracuse beat Georgia Tech at home. How good are the Orange? How good is Kyle McCord at quarterback? I think that they're going to beat Stanford, but I want to see if Stanford's able to make this a close game. And if they are, I think that is extremely notable to focus on. So tier list really hasn't changed much. Tier 1 is Miami. Tier 2 is Louisville, Clemson. And I've also, Boston College is knocking on that door. Like, they are banging on the door saying it's Boston College, open up. And they're right there. Like, I feel like they are in, if we're micro-analyzing this, Boston College is in tier 3 by themselves. And then tier 4 is sort of the rest of the teams right now with Syracuse, Georgia Tech, NC State for the time being, maybe Pittsburgh. It's so much confusion right now that we just won't get a better glimpse on and understanding on until we see how this schedule pans out. So week 4 going to be a very interesting one in Atlantic Coast Conference play. That is going to wrap up this Wednesday edition of the show. We will only have one more episode for the remainder of the week, and I'm working to get my guy G Money, Grant Mulligan, on for that episode for a buy-sell game, players to watch, and explaining why Louisville will win on Saturday. But that's going to wrap up this Wednesday edition. Everyone have a great day. We'll see you right back here very soon.